our first speaker coming up, Tristan Harris. I was really lucky. I was at Wisdom 2.0, and it's kind of a schmooze fest like any conference, and so there's only a couple talks that I managed to see, and someone, a good friend of mine who knows me, said, "You have to see this talk," and so pulled me in, sat down, and sure enough, he was an incredible speaker and bringing an incredible perspective to this space. And the thing that I really appreciated about Tristan's perspective is that, and that's something that I think is a part of this consciousness hacking culture, is it wasn't just a question of how can we live with technology and use wisdom to interface with technology, but what Tristan is here to talk about is actually how can we rethink the way that we design interfaces, and can we really optimize deep and meaningful human experience in that design and really change the rules for that design. And not only is he working inside of Google to make that happen, but really he's creating a design movement around this perspective. So we're really lucky to have Tristan here, so thank you very much.
Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
For sure. Sure.
Yeah, 1 second. Edit this part out. Thought we were seeing that a little bit. So I think give me 1 second. Okay.
I think it is connected. It's got a... Cool. All right. I'm going to breeze through some of this to leave more time for Q&A. I want to talk to you about 3 things today. The first is a framing of a really important problem that I think is going on. Second is going to be some design principles about how we might go about fixing that. And the third would be a system that would support those design changes. So specifically, I find myself in a lot. This is the artist Banksy, who he has this tweet with this image that he wrote, and the tweet says, "Don't let them take all your time away." And I feel like this all the time in my relationship with technology. And this is not a new thing. I mean, this is sort of another vision of the future that others have anticipated. I thought the tweet at the bottom was kind of cute. This is not a new thing. There's a great book in 1982 by this author Neil Postman called "Amusing Ourselves to Death." I don't know if any of you, some of you have seen it or heard of it. "Amusing Ourselves to Death" was written in the age of television, but he had this great quote that just summarized essentially this vision of distraction, this sort of future where we'd be amusing ourselves with technology, so much so. And I just wanted to read it to you as a good sort of starting off point. And it ends, I'll open this up here. And he wrote it this way. He said, he was comparing the 2 visions of the future, one vision of George Orwell's 1984, and the other vision of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. These 2 dystopian visions of the future. And if you're familiar with it, Orwell's 1984 is all about kind of direct power, boots on faces, limiting language, limiting freedom, that kind of power. And then there was this other form of power, which is indirect power, that Huxley was worried about. That we would just saturate people with so much stuff that we would, as in his words, technology would undo our capacities to think, and we would love that. We would come to love the technologies that would undo us. And specifically, he had this great quote, which is, "What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance." In other words, as Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists failed to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. So this is a historic conversation about essentially what is so seductive to the mind that when it shows up we can't really resist. And I think of what's going on with technology as kind of putting a new choice on life's menu. Your phone puts a new choice on life's menu at every given moment that could theoretically give you something that's better than reality at any moment, right? And that's going to go even further with VR in sort of a different way. And I have a personal relationship with this problem because I used to be an entrepreneur and I had a startup called Apture. I thought that we were helping people learn about things and be curious. It was this company where you could kind of highlight anything and learn about it instantly and explore and go really deep. And I had to start to question about when was this technology that I was putting into the world really a net positive contribution to people's lives versus when was I just distracting people from reading or from doing something? And I think that's kind of the bigger question that concerns me now is when is technology a distraction and when is it actually a net positive contribution to our lives? So I want to sort of explore this problem. The first thing I want to start with is by talking about the attention economy. So one thing we don't talk about is that we live in this attention economy. So whether you're building a meditation app or an addictive game or an educational news website, you win by getting people to spend time. Right? Many of you in this room, if you're entrepreneurs or engineers, you're familiar with this. You have to get engagement. You have to get people to come back. You have to message them, notify them. You have to use some clever copywriting skills, right? And so it means that you kind of use the tactics of our day. There's whole industries built up on teaching people how to seduce people's psychological instincts because that's the best way to get people to spend time. And there's teams of people, literally thousands of engineers whose job it is to do that every day, right? Many of you might work at some of the companies that have to do this. I mean, we all do. And it leads us to this, what I call a race to the bottom of the brainstem, where it's a race to seduce people's deepest psychological instincts to spend time on things. And many of you know this is the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, where they raised, I think, $51 million for the ALS disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, and it was a record. But what I'm questioning is not whether that's a good thing, but whether these should be the rules we play by. Is that the future we want, where the way to win is a race to be more clever at seducing people's psychological instincts than the other guy? Because that leads to this kind of perverse competition. So, and what it leads us into is this all or nothing relationship with technology, which many of you might relate to. You're either on and you're connected, but then you're distracted all the time, right? Because you get sucked into all this stuff. Or you just say, I'm going to turn it off. And that to meditate or something like that, or to be mindful, I have to have my technology completely off. But it's really kind of a bad menu because you're either really distracted or you're missing out or fear of missing out on the benefits of technology completely. And is that the relationship we want, right? Like either I have Facebook on my phone and I get distracted all the time, or I have to take it completely off my phone and then I'm missing out on all the benefits of Facebook, for which there are many. And so how do we instead restore choice? How do we have a relationship with technology where it's actually augmenting and amplifying our capacities and human potential? And I think that's something that resonates with this group. and not leads us to do things that we later feel like we wish we didn't do. And that's a kind of a design question, because where would this choice come from? Well, we could come from us, right? We could say, well, we just need to have better willpower and better self-control, and we could use these things in a more powerful, self-regulated way. But one thing we have to acknowledge is that our conscious choice-making energy, or our resistance power, is kind of like a battery. And I think many of you probably know this research from Roy Baumeister, who's at Florida State University, wrote a book called Willpower, and it's all about essentially how our conscious choice-making energy and our ability to resist things in our environment is sort of this finite resource. And so every choice we put in front of you is like depleting the battery. So every email we send someone, every notification we send someone, we're kind of taking away from your total store of choice-making energy that you have available to you for the rest of your day. And so in terms of having a relationship with technology that involves choice, it can't just come from better willpower, because that's the very thing that's being kind of compromised here, right? And it leaves us, from a design perspective, with, we're kind of not just designing people's conscious choices, we're designing their unconscious choices. So do you guys know the distinction in System 1 and System 2 from Daniel Kahneman? So Daniel Kahneman, the behavioral economist, wrote about these sort of two fundamental processes in the brain. System 1 is kind of intuitive processing. It's where your brain goes to by default, sort of like the path of least resistance. And then System 2 is kind of conscious, deliberative choice making. So when we're designing for someone's behavior or choices, whether we want to or not, we're designing their conscious decisions by the way we frame questions to them. And we're also designing their unconscious behavior, because at some point when that battery goes empty and the person's just clicking on the next thing, the way that we shape that menu as designers is the thing that's going to determine their behavior. And so how do we decide what to put on that menu? And to sort of go into that a little bit, there's this great study that I have some background information through Netflix about, which is preferences. So we think that what people want, if we're designing for someone's choices, let's say you're a designer at a software company, and you're trying to design for someone's preferences. So this person says that they want X. So we should just give them X, right? Well, our preferences are not always constant, and Netflix had a great example of this when they found that if they took a user who used to get DVDs in the mail. Do you guys remember when Netflix used to get, right, this is a long time ago now? And Netflix used to get, you used to order your DVDs in the mail, and then 2 days later, 3 days later, you get your DVDs, right? So if you took a user who was just using the DVDs by mail service, and then you switched them, you activated them into a Netflix Instant Watch user, what they found is that the person's preferences changed. Because in one case, they're picking for their future self, and the other case, they're picking for their in-the-moment self. So this is just like the behavioral economics research that if you go to a supermarket when you're hungry, you have different preferences, and you end up with not just more unhealthy food, but more food than when you go to the supermarket and you're not hungry. And I'm not saying whether one is more right than the other. I'm not saying that impulsive, in-the-moment preferences are bad. But I want you to see that there's this distinction between preferences that are not always constant. That if you're designing for what someone wants, that's always changing. So the question then is, what's a North Star for design? Because our choices are always situated, and we're designing the situations and the menus that people pick from. Right? Imagine a world that only lets you pick for your future self. It'd be a very different world than a world that's only asking your present self, which is kind of converging on the technology world we live in today. Okay, so we need some new ethical menus to design for people. So how do we do that? So I want to talk about a few design principles, and I'm going to rush through these because I want to leave a lot more time. And one distinction is that instead of designing products the way designers typically think of their job, I want to argue that we're designing a relationship that a person has with the product. Because as we just discussed, people cannot control their exact in-the-moment behavior moment to moment, and we're responsible not just for the product, but the relationship someone has with it. And to do that, we need to sort of pay attention to a few different variables of what makes for a good relationship with a product. I'm going to rush through these. So one is boundedness. So there's this great behavioral economics experiment where if you give a bunch of people a bowl of soup to sit down at a table and eat from a bowl of soup, different bowls of soup, except that a few of the participants are eating from a bowl of soup that has a bottomless tube at the end of it, meaning the tube is constantly refilling more soup into the bowl as they're eating it. And we think that how much we're eating is a matter of choice. But it turns out that the people who had a bottomless bowl ate 76% more soup and didn't realize at all that they were having this extra soup. They were actually no more sated than the other group. And they, anyway, a whole bunch of different things. But basically they ate way more soup and they didn't know it. And a lot of technology today looks like this. Bottomless bowls of feeds, right, that are intended to basically never end, and we don't really think about when we're done. And so one way to fix this is to give people a bottom on their bowl, to let people choose how big a plate they want, or what they want the bottom on their bowl to be. So design-wise, you can imagine, what if your email asked you how much time you want to spend in your email today? And you said, I want to spend about 30 minutes, and it was then on your team to help you spend that amount of time in your email, right? Or imagine that if you had a particular website you wanted to monitor your usage of, and you could mark that website, then when you went there, it actually gave you some feedback about when you were last there, and at the beginning of the day, maybe ask you how big a plate you wanted for that website for the day, so that the next time you went there, it would actually help you sort of be mindful of that. Right? This is technology that's on your team to live by the values that you have, the preferences that you have. These are a few different design examples. Another thing, I'm going to skip actually some of this parts, just because I want to get to the interesting stuff. Reflective. So another thing that makes a good relationship is if the relationship reflects back to you what's been going on in the relationship. You can imagine some relationships which make that completely opaque and pretend as if there's no reflection and that nothing we've ever done together ever exists. And there's different kinds of relationships where there's an acknowledgement about the relationship we've had and how we've influenced each other. We do this in things like cars, when we're designing cars, but imagine if we did these with things like phones, where when you're unlocking your phone, just like a speed limit sign gives you some feedback or reflects back to you some information. What if we had different ways of reflecting back some of that information to people when they're using phones? Or browsers that help you see where your time went, or as we showed in this example, or in the case of news articles, reflecting back to you the cost of the article you're about to read, and things like rescue time, which do this as well. And the really important thing about a relationship, I think, is framing choices in terms of the values people care about. So when you're organizing a menu for someone and you're designing a set of choices, how can we organize those choices by what matters to the person? So a good example of this is Hitmonk. How many of you have been you booked a flight and you find yourself sitting at an airport at around 11 o'clock at night in some random city, and you're on a 4-hour layover, and you wonder, why didn't I just book that extra flight for the extra $30 or $40, right? It would have been a little bit easier. Why did I just save that $30? That really didn't make sense. And Hitmonk realized that the values you're putting in front of someone in terms of sorting prices for flights, you could also sort them by the human experience of travel, of what really matters in a travel experience, what really matters to the person's life when they're making this choice. And this is like every moment in technology. When someone's making a choice in front of you, how can you frame the choice in terms of what matters in their life? Or if you use Google Calendar and you have this little meeting selector thing on the right-hand side, and you're booking a one-on-one with your boss. And currently the meeting room selector is inheriting this value that says, well, let's help you find a room that's available. But what if we asked, well, what's that meeting room for? And what would be the deepest set of human experiences that could occur by picking a place for two people to catch up? You can imagine adding on life's menu a walking meeting that's nearby, right? Or you can imagine that when you're looking for travel directions and you show people, these are the 2 subway options. In Google Maps currently, it also shows you that you could also order an Uber, and this is how much it would cost, and this is the time. But in addition to that, let's say you told Google that one of the things you wanted was more exercise in your life. And it wouldn't be coercing you, it would just add that other option to life's menu so you could compare. So what if it helps you basically see that there's an option to walk, and this is how many calories it would burn? Or what if you said, instead of exercise, what I really value is productivity or mindfulness. And so instead of just putting the walking option on life's menu, it also showed you, that you've got it's productivity. There's 28 minutes left in this podcast, and there's 35 minutes on this walk. This would be a technology that's more on your team to help you live by your values. If you were into meditation, you can imagine that being 25 minutes or 35 minutes of silence, right? Just something that's framing choices in terms of what matters to you in your life in the long run. And so one thing we're doing here is we're also changing the design question. And we're asking a different question than we normally would. If you're designing an application that's like getting people from point A to point B, the previous design goal is let's just get people from point A to point B efficiently, right? But we changed the design goal to say, well, what is getting from point A to point B about? Well, it's about people's life experience. So what we really mean is, how do we help people get from point A to point B well for their life? And I want to show you one more example of that, which is when you're designing interpersonal relationships. And I won't go into it, but there's this background comes from a bunch of literature on like marriage counseling, which I found to be really helpful when thinking about these design questions. Because you're really facilitating a different relationship between two people. So if you take these two people, let's say there's Nancy on the left and John on the right. Nancy's working on a document on the left, and John on the right wants to ask her for that document, right? So this happens to us every day in interpersonal messaging. What does John do? Well, he opens a chat window and blows away her attention, right? Just completely bulldozes her attention. And every single time he does that, there's a serious cost. It takes about 23 minutes on average to resume focus after any interruption, which is a huge, huge cost. And there's a second thing that this woman, Gloria Mark at UC Irvine, who studied interruption science for 10 years, has found, which is that the more external interruptions someone gets in an hour, if you look at their next hour of usage, they actually self-interrupt more. So what appears to be happening is essentially the more external interruptions we get, it increases the internal clock rate for when we self-interrupt. So how do we fix this? Well, imagine that if we're, instead of just designing the product, we're also taking on responsibility for designing the relationship between two people. So what if Nancy this time can mark that she's focused? And when John wants to ask her for that document, he can still open up his chat window, and he can still get the thought off his mind because he needs to get that thought off of his mind now while he still remembers, right? We don't want to stop him from getting that thought off his mind. But this time we'll hold the messages so that they're actually going to get delivered automatically when Nancy goes unfocused. So we've basically created a new choice for Nancy and John where Nancy can still be focused and not worry about anything, and John can send the message and get on with his life. Except you're all saying, well, I would never trust this because what if I miss something important? And you can solve that by making sure that Nancy knows that any message that could go to her has a way of consciously upgrading to escalate the message, right? So what we're doing is we're changing the default setting. So the default choice behind chatting goes from a default of accidentally interrupting people all the time to instead a conscious interruption. So that's all we're doing, right? So again, we're changing the design goal from helping people send messages efficiently to instead helping send messages to each other well. Instead of just saying, our goal for chat, for designing chat, is just to deliver the message as fast as possible. We're saying, what are the human values associated in two people communicating? I know I'm running out of time, but I'm going to do a quick blurb on this. So I'm hinting at these human values we're talking about. What values are we really designing for? What is life really about? And to do that, we have to invoke Thich Nhat Hanh. So Thich Nhat Hanh came to Google about 1.5 years ago, and some people who were organizing his visit knew about the work I was doing on attention, design, ethics, and said, you can basically get an hour of Thich Nhat Hanh's time. We'll actually siphon an hour of his time away to you if you can basically rope in as many designers as you possibly can to talk about this issue of attention. Because when he came to Silicon Valley, do you guys know who Thich Nhat Hanh is? Okay, he's basically an international spokesperson for mindfulness and meditation. Very famous guy, written many books on meditation. And so he came, and we basically had 2 hours with him. And we had the lead designers of all these products. It was the most amazing meeting because you have, when you walk into a room, these long brown-robed Buddhist monks on one side of the table, and then a bunch of technology geeks that look like us on the other side of the table. You never walk into Google on a day and see that kind of meeting. And it was really about essentially listening to what people are really after. Like, what is the design question we're doing really about? And he said, I always reference this example, he joked in our conversation, what if there was instead of a spell check, we had a compassion check? And that as people were writing, it might highlight words in yellow that were perceived as abrasive. But the general nature of the conversation was about what really matters to people's lives, and how do you design for their well-being and their attention. And this conversation didn't just happen at Google, this happens in the real world too. And one of my favorite examples to reference really quickly is Couchsurfing. I'm out, I know. And Couchsurfing, if you guys don't know, is basically created Airbnb as a website for helping people looking for a place to stay find a place to stay. So if you're designing Couchsurfing, what do you think your goal might be? How would you count success if you're Couchsurfing? Well, you'd think that maybe we would count success if we match someone who's looking for a place to stay with a place to stay. So someone who's looking for a place to stay found a place to stay. That's success, right? We can put a metric and a counter that says win, right? But they said that's not what Couchsurfing is about. The deeper human thing, the human life thing that Couchsurfing is about is that two people who've never met have a lasting positive experience. And the most amazing thing is they have a metric for this that I want to share with you. And the way they measure this is they take, for two people who meet up, they take the number of days that they spend together. So let's say I go to Paris. They would take the 4 days that I spent in Paris, and then they would estimate how many hours are in those 4 days. So they try to get an exact count of how many hours did Couchsurfing create between two people. And then it asks both people how positive were those hours. And then what they do is they subtract all of the amount of time that people spent on the website. So you're left with just what they call net orchestrated conviviality, which is just the net positive times, the net new positive hours that would have never existed if Couchsurfing didn't exist. Can you imagine if there was an entire world that actually cared that deeply about new positive hours that exist in your life because of the product existing in your life? Can you imagine if there was dating apps that measured as their success not the number of swipes left and right that people make, but the number of people who found whatever it is that they were looking for, and subtracted all the time that people spent? Can you imagine if social networks like LinkedIn, instead of measuring the connections that people created or the messages that were sent, measured the people who found jobs that they were really glad to get, and subtracted the time that they spent, right, that they didn't feel so good about later? So can you just imagine a world where you're not exerting conscious, vigilant choice-making, like questioning of your environment all the time, but you can actually trust fall into this world, and everyone is on your team to help you live the way you want. To do that, you need a new system. I know I'm so over time. Today we measure success in time spent, as many of you know, which means that we're sort of screwed because everyone has to maximize the amount of time they spend. But we've solved this problem before. We solved it when we created different ways of valuing success. And we solved it with organic. I can explain this later. We solved it with organic when we said this is a different kind of apple. We solved it with LEED certification. We said this is a different kind of building, so you can value the space in a different way. What if we had something like that for technology? Where if you were designing to create net positive contributions in people's lives, you could be valued in a different way so it would actually work. So you could actually be a successful company by basically being on the team of the user to live their life. And doing that would amount to moving from a world that currently measures success in time spent to a world that measures success in time well spent. So I'll leave you to questions. Sorry for going overboard.
There we go. Thank you so much, Tristan. So what we're going to do is we're going to take questions. Do you want to, you can kind of point out whoever you want to answer, and then we'll try to pass the mic around as much as we can.
Cool.
So if you could come over to the sides from the mic.
Thanks. So Couchsurfing is not as big as Airbnb. So a decision for me as a designer is like, I want my company to be big enough to have influence. I want it to be successful. I want lots of people to use it. But every example of a company that is using lots of time and fucking us over in this regard is big, and every example of someone who's doing time well spent is small. So how do I balance that? Are there real trade-offs? Can I get time well spent without trading off the bigness and success of the company?
Well, so part of the idea of this is that if we created something like a time well spent organic label, so let's say that a bunch of people over the next several years collected together, just like the first. Is this on? Can you guys hear me? Yeah. If we had almost like an organic movement, where a bunch of designers effectively were the organic designers of technology, and they all started as a group advocating for a different kind of thing, and recognizing it and using common language. And eventually that led to some kind of label that got premium shelf space in app stores, that had browsers that make it easier to route you to those choices. Then you could win, right? And that's what this is about. Because so long as we don't have that, what you're talking about is exactly the situation that we'll be in, right? Because absent something like this, you're forced to play by the rules of what I call the matrix. Like, you're forced to play by the rules of abusing people's psychological instincts to get traffic and more use. So we actually need to have something so that when you're doing the right thing, you get valued and upscored for doing that.
Thanks. I feel really acknowledged.
Yeah, cool.
Thank you. Who would like to ask a question? Actually, if folks want to ask questions, if they could come right over here to the side, that would be great.
Thanks, Tristan. That was great. I was wondering if there are pre-existing apps for doing the things that you mentioned, like limiting time on various sites. I know there's like little applets you can put on your browser to limit your Facebook use, but other things I'd be very curious about.
Yeah, there's different things. I'm sure many of you use different tools. There's things like Stay Focused, which lets you set like a plate size on certain websites so that during the course of a day, you run out, or things like that. I think all these tools, I mean, I can mention a few more specific ones if you're looking for like productivity tool, like hacks. What are some good ones? I think in general, what's sad is that many of them don't work that well, and they could be a lot better. And I think there's a lot of things but I do think that it's possible to make them a lot better than they are. So things like Rescue Time, which basically collect a footprint of your time usage across different apps and websites over the course of a week, show you a weekly report. But this doesn't work because it's sort of like showing you at the end of a week of binging on donuts, a mirror, and being like, here's what you look like now, but it doesn't change in the moment of choice when there's donuts all around me, like what I'm about to do. So I think one of the things that needs to happen is that these reflections have to happen right at the moment of choice, which is why in the browser example I showed this number and this sort of color change when you're about to go to a website that you're trying to be more mindful of. There's a way of doing that better that's integrated right into the choice point. So in terms of tools, I think things like Stay Focused, Calm.com does some things. Focus at Will helps you like focus your attention for periods of time. I think there's different ways of bidding these things up together to be better, but yeah.
Hi, I watched your presentation and in the elevator found out you had some asks on your website. This would really much serve me and what I'm into, and I'd like to be part of things. Do you have any asks of this community of things like we could just start doing right now?
Yeah, the main thing we're looking to do, and really I'm trying to make it not like, oh, this is like my project, I'm trying to involve you guys. It's more like this is really a thing where if you agree this is a problem, there should be a community of people who form around it who want to do something about it. Specifically, I think designers who can collectively start to paint a picture of what something different would look like. So actually on Saturday, 2 days ago, we held our first redesign day. We got about 60 designers together to basically redesign screens. And we tried to teach a different methodology that would basically show, so we could create almost like a gallery of the different ways screens could look to be better on people's team, to help them live the life they want. And what I'd like to do is basically put those things in a gallery and post them online so that people can see, like, wow, this would be a much better world to live in. Instead of that being some kind of top-down concept video that some big company does, that's a thing that basically a lot of people, like through bottom-up support, are collectively learning how to do and saying that they're a part of it. So they have a stake in it, and so that something like that could actually exist. Because this can't exist as a thing that one big company or several big companies want to do. It's like organic can't introduce, Walmart can't introduce organic, right? So you have to have essentially a bunch of bottom-up people who just believe this is important come together and start to show that. So is that helpful? So basically designers, for future design events, there's a empoweringdesign.org, there's a newsletter, and you can sign up if you're interested and you're a designer.
I guess more specifically, the idea of certification seems to me like there'd be almost like a committee, or maybe getting people together to make a proposal, or I don't know, a nonprofit or something to that extent.
Yeah, there's a group of people who are working on that right now, and it's a challenging process to figure out how to organize people to be, like, who's going to be on that committee. Obviously, it's got to be a diverse group of people from a lot of different backgrounds. So that's starting to emerge. If you're interested, go to that website or talk to me afterwards. Yeah.
Thanks, Tristan. I'm wondering if you're aware of what scientific research there is around this kind of concept, and what sort of metrics were measured and what were the outcomes of that research in terms of how the difference that it made in people's lives.
Like scientific research on what the difference then?
On time well spent, for example. Okay, so making a more human impact instead of taking people's attention away. Is there any scientific research around this in terms of the value that it adds to people's lives?
That's a broad question. I mean, when I think about things like Couchsurfing, my collaborator Joe is actually the one who came up with that metric. And of course, from Couchsurfing, there's examples of people having these incredibly meaningful experiences where, Israelis and Palestinians stay with each other, and it like totally changes their worldview. Right? There's things like that. What's different? This is not a scientific research thing, and I think I say that not because I'm trying to cop out. I'm saying that because the North Star here isn't happiness. We're not trying to optimize happiness for everybody, moment to moment. There's something deeper here, which is about like meaning, basically. That what like retrospective views on life that feel like net positive contributions to people's lives, which could be challenging. It may not be that someone's galvanic skin response or that they had a smile on their face when they were going through it, but that retrospectively something felt like a meaningful contribution. So it gets into a very deep conversation about how you even name that or measure that or talk about that. Now I can have that conversation, but it's not a science thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the talk. It's really interesting, inspiring. I'm wondering how kind of the contradicting goals that can be in this. So you have like design for profit on one side and design for, going from A to B well, and talking about placing a value onto that. And usually when we place a value on things, so some people who can afford that are going to have that premium experience.
Right.
But other people are just going to be like, they have to go through the commercials, right?
That's right.
And they have to. So I'm wondering if there's any space in this design area for a sort of manifesto or kind of human rights or digital human rights kind
Totally.
of thing.
Yeah, I think there does need to be like my friend actually calls it good choice-making environments should be a human right, which I think is really a good way to say it. There's a deeper issue here, which is just basically what is ethical persuasion. I don't know if that's going to resonate with you guys, but what this is about is essentially if you acknowledge that there's a world of influence and you can't turn influence off, like psychology and persuasion and influence and all this stuff is just always existing all the time. We're not saying we can like knock that out and that goes away. We're just saying now, okay, once we acknowledge and recognize that there's this like world of influence, what I call like the matrix, like there's just all this stuff that's influencing us all the time. What does it mean to have a portion of that locked out, saying this is a part that's on my team that's ethically influencing me? But it does bring up these power inequality type issues that you're bringing up, right? Like some people can afford that, other people may not be able to. This is what happened though with food, right? Where if you just like trust fall into the world, it's not happened with the world. If you trust fall into the world and you don't think about what you're eating, doing, whatever, you end up spending more money than you have, because credit cards are designed to seduce you into spending money. You end up eating food that probably isn't very good for you. In other words, the defaults aren't very safe for people. And so the only way to kind of live safely is to be like vigilant and like questioning things all the time. And so there's already these kinds of power inequalities in the system. Some people can afford organic and some people can't. There are examples though where there's a little bit more choice in there. And for example, YouTube has this thing where they introduce skippable ads. So there's people who they watch the ad and then after 5 seconds in the beginning of the ad, it says you can skip the ad. And what that's doing is actually enabling anybody who wants to skip the ad to just hit skip. And it ended up making more money, I think, I don't know this for sure, but I think it made more money for Google and for YouTube because the people who stayed were the people who were actually more valuable to the advertiser. So that was an example where we're basically not creating a power differential, but anyone can hit skip, and it's sort of better for the people who have that value. But there's still many power inequality issues that are as a part of this, and I think there should be sort of a doctrine of rights that people should have. It's really hard to name because it actually is the intersection of essentially what we know about behavioral science and psychology, the very, very fringes. So hopefully that's helpful.
There is in machine learning this notion of regret minimization, which seems to potentially be a metric and approach to that retrospective. You probably have to do it across multiple time scales or something to do it properly, but
totally. We should talk. The Jeff Bezos actually uses regret minimization as his life philosophy, and I think it essentially there's an important question in. It's not that we want to take this retrospective end-of-life view on everything, right? Like you can imagine the end-of-life version of yourself dictating every single one of your choices, and you might miss out on some things that at the end of your life you're going to have a certain bias about what things you wish you didn't do or did. There's this guy Cass Sunstein who wrote the book Nudge, who says if you're trying to nudge people, do we want to nudge people towards a life that's long, dry, and chocolate-free? Some of life's greatest experiences are peak experiences and things we might partially regret later. So we're not saying we want to totally eliminate regret, but there's some obvious places where people are doing things and they feel not so good about it and they can't really control it later, and it sort of starts to feel like an addiction, but that's I think only part of it. And there's better ways we can support people. But regret minimization is I think one of the new components we want to plug into the machine learning system of the world. So yeah.
I know you somewhat talked about this from a design principle and a little bit from, I guess, a business standpoint. But from an impression and monetization standpoint, I guess if you look at a lot of these things, for example, I know Zynga, they make a lot of their money from the users who just keep spending money in a gambling habit. Totally. Or even Google itself, its search engine, it's based on impressions. So if you're not actually using it all the time, you don't make as much money off of it. So how does this kind of fit against, that model of business? Because I can see it working from the standpoint of creating a committee around it, but if it takes people's revenues down, then there's always a really strong barrier.
Totally. When it takes everyone's revenues down, and when something that's everyone agrees is good for the world, but that takes everyone's revenues down, usually that's where government or regulation or policy gets involved. The organic thing ends up being a more profitable thing. So if you can argue that in the long run it's more profitable, then it ends up working out. Because basically what's happening now, let's see, there's a different way to answer this question, which is Cass Sunstein, who wrote Nudge, another book called Why Nudge. Do you guys know the book Nudge by any chance? Some of you? No? It's basically about how we can nudge people's moment-to-moment choices. The greatest example is the defaults in a driver's license organ donation form, and if the default box is that you're going to donate your organs, then 95% of people do. If the default is that they don't, then 95% of people don't donate their organs. So if you're in charge of basically nudging people, what's the right thing to do? Anyway, he has this way of describing this problem, which is it calls it a behavioral market failure, where it's a new category of market failure, where a market won't self-correct to address people's true preferences because they are incapable, people's behavior is incapable of changing. And so that sort of speaks to the policy angle to addressing this. This might involve paid models for things. Yeah, or hybrid models or something. Oh, sorry. The question was, how do we pay for this, essentially, if this means basically lower revenue for people? Totally free business models might be harmed by something like this. Hybrid business models might do better. The interesting thing is that we've sort of made costs of a lot of these services really pretty efficient. If you think about, do you know what the average user is worth to Facebook today in a year? You said $3, you said $90. It's actually, the last number that I heard was several months ago, is $8 a year. So if you were to imagine, would you pay Facebook $8 for the removal of the incentive to take more of your time? Would you pay Facebook $8 to have just a version of Facebook that just doesn't have that goal, right? So it's interesting when we don't have a transparent cost structure on internet companies, but if we did, then you can actually see what that cost would be. But again, that gets into his power inequality issue, right? Some people can afford that change, and other people can't. But again, that's the same thing with food. This is a much bigger issue than even just like technology, but yeah.
We're gonna get a couple more. We're gonna get a couple more questions.
Cool.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. That was great.
Awesome.
One thing I noticed was like if you're doing this concept of nudging or like being a paternal libertarian, I guess, of the software world and like giving more choices, like for example, hey, you could walk and read and listen to an ebook, or you could take an Uber, so you're adding more choices, and how does that counterbalance with like at Chipotle, there's less choices and I'm happier. So like I saw a lot of UX you're putting up there, you're giving me more choices, and I'm just like, is that what I want? That kind of stresses me out.
Totally. So it's a great question. Did you guys, was that on the tape? You don't have to repeat it, okay. So there was a slide earlier that I didn't explain very well that was about the split between conscious choices and unconscious choices. And as a designer, you're always you're forcing people to make some choices, and then you're like taking away a bunch of other choices and just defaulting them into some things, right? And so you inevitably have to make that trade-off. The design solutions I was presenting aren't that I want to put more choices in front of people, but I want to... So in other words, if you think of it as by spending less conscious decision-making energy, I end up making choices that I later feel good about. Like it's frictionless to make the choice that I would feel great about later. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it makes sense. It's tough. There's all the software today, like I was using Slack today, and it sent me an email, and it's like, hey, we noticed we've been notifying you too much. Do you want to turn that off? Like, I don't know. There's so many options and choices with all these softwares today, and like, I'm just apprehensive to like see any more choices at all.
Well, that's why like standards, and as a human right, like sort of ethical design standards or default settings as a human right might be a good thing, so that there's fewer of these sort of like, well, you can change it if you want to, but we have to send you an email. But when I send you an email, I'm depleting your conscious choice-making energy. So there's all these services that are asking you, like, how can we be more on your team? And suddenly you're just overwhelmed with all these things that want to be more on your team, right? I actually face this problem. I'm like Mr. Distraction at like Google, so people just send me all sorts of stuff on distraction all the time, like articles in the New Yorker, and I'm just like overwhelmed. Yeah. And it's like that's why it's like this. We also don't want to say that people shouldn't make conscious choices. We do. We just want to put the right conscious choices in front of you. So
yeah, that makes sense. Or, I mean, for me, I just use it less. Like I make that personal choice. Or
right.
I guess that's you're trying to. Maybe there's a lot of power in the hands of these people who are trying to nudge. I don't know.
Exactly, whether they want it or not. Yeah.
So our
last question.
In the history in general, like we've seen, like I have a feeling that like mostly we've been having lesser and lesser choices as we go about, and like people have been like adapting to those kind of things. Do you have like a really good example of somewhere in history that where like a technology or a design change that actually like enabled us to like be less distracted or anything, and over time that's proved to be like really good for like a country or like a city or like a company or like something like that? Do you have an example?
You mean like a digital modern technology that's been less distracting overall, or
not just modern technology, but like even like probably like 70 years back, like France did something that changed, like everybody started biking or something like that. Like
I was going to say, a bicycle is like one of the classic examples. So my historical interest in this is that I got into technology because of the rhetoric that computers were a bicycle for our minds. In the same way, there's a Steve Jobs quote about that. It's the Xerox PARC kind of 1970s human potential oriented vision of technology, where you give someone a bicycle and they put in the same raw energy and power, and they get way more out of their raw power without any distractions or leadways or anything that's wrong. And so I think a bicycle is a great example because you're always in conversation with it about whether you're going where you want to go. You're always consciously involved in it on some level, but it's only providing a net positive contribution to your life.
Reason that I ask is more in lines of like, do people always evolve to get used to this distraction and then like go about with like it as though that's normal, or does it actually like improve their lives? Is kind of the question.
So one part is like, do people adapt?
Right.
And the second is,
like, I mean, or like, does making these kind of changes, would that not make much sense because people just adapt to the newer distraction system in some sense?
Right. So I think it's important to realize that, I should stop, but there's a class of problem in urban planning called a wicket problem, where essentially any change you make, people will adapt to it, and any change you make will require a lot of resources, and it's irreversible, and it's a great thing to look up on Wikipedia if you have some time to look it up. And it kind of speaks to this problem that we're in, which is that you're right, if we do make some changes, people will just adapt to it and route around it. But I think for me, like, what I'm trying to do is just this conversation, like, opens up a lot of questions in people's minds, and that's very powerful. So I think people questioning and seeing the structure of all this is like kind of my North Star, rather than saying that there's these exact design solutions that are going to be the right answer, if that makes sense. Yeah. Thanks a lot, guys.
Tristan, thank you so much, Tristan. That was beautiful. Thank you.